There is a question you have been carrying for a long time, one you haven't shared with anyone, not with your husband, not with your children, not even with your confessor. You think about it alone, sometimes in the small hours of the night when sleep won't come, sometimes at Mass, while everyone around you seems perfectly fine, and you feel as though something deep inside you simply refuses to heal. The question is this: if I pray, if I go to confession, if I genuinely try to live well, if I love God with everything I have, then why do I still suffer so much? Why me? Why won't it stop? And beneath that question lies an even darker one, the one that truly hurts. Is God punishing me? Have I done something so terribly wrong that I deserve this? Stay with me, because Saint Teresa of Jesus left behind an answer that no one has yet given you. It isn't that anyone has deliberately kept it from you. It is simply that very few people know it, and those who do don't always know how to deliver it in a way that reaches the exact place where it hurts. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew how. She lived it first in her own body, came to understand it through an intellect illumined by God, and set it down in writing with a clarity that astonishes, because it comes from someone who did not suffer a little. She suffered enormously. She suffered in ways that you and I can barely begin to imagine. And yet she wrote about suffering not with bitterness, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had come out the other side and was reaching back a hand toward you. Before we go any further, I ask one thing of you. Write in the comments the name of whatever is weighing most heavily on you right now. You don't need to explain a thing. Just the name. One word. Because what you are about to hear carries more power when it is spoken from a real place, your real place, rather than from the safe distance of someone who listens without letting themselves be touched. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what Teresa taught about suffering cannot be contained in a single video, and you need to be here for what comes next. What you are about to receive was kept for you. Each part builds on the one before it. Don't skip ahead. Listen to all of it. There was a moment in the life of Saint Teresa of Jesus when she herself believed God had abandoned her. This is not speculation. It is not a pious interpretation added centuries later by someone wanting to make her seem more human. It is something she wrote with her own hand, with an honesty that still catches readers off guard today if they come to it unprepared. She wrote it in the book of her life, her spiritual autobiography, the account of a woman who looked inward with a courage that very few human beings have ever possessed, and who recorded what she found there without softening or embellishing a single line. She wrote that for nearly 20 years she lived in an interior darkness she did not know how to name. 20 years, not 20 days, not 20 weeks. 20 years during which she went to choir to pray alongside her sisters and felt her words arriving nowhere. 20 years during which she knelt before the tabernacle, and the silence of God was so absolute that sometimes it took an enormous effort simply to stay there on her knees rather than rise and walk away. 20 years during which suffering, both of the body and of the soul, was a constant presence that did not lift when she begged it to lift, or when her confessors prayed over her. Does that ring true for you? Perhaps not the number of years, but surely that feeling of praying into a silence that never breaks. That feeling of doing everything your faith asks of you and still carrying a weight that does not diminish. That feeling of watching other people who seem to move through life with a lightness you cannot find no matter how hard you search for it, and quietly wondering what they have that you lack. What they are doing right that you are doing wrong. That is the first mistake, and Saint Teresa of Jesus identified it with surgical precision because she made it herself for a very long time. The mistake of reading your own suffering as evidence of personal failure, as a sign that something in you is broken in a way God cannot or will not repair. As proof that you are less, that you are worth less, that God looks upon you with less tenderness than He bestows upon those who appear to suffer less. Saint Teresa of Jesus says that this reasoning is entirely backwards. She does not say it harshly. She does not say it like someone correcting a person who ought to know better. She says it with the gentleness of someone who walked that same mistaken road for 2 decades and knows exactly what it costs to realize the error. She speaks from the inside. And what she says is this: suffering is not the language of God's abandonment. It is one of the most intimate languages God uses to speak to the souls He most wants to draw close to Himself. But this is precisely where most explanations about suffering fall short. Because telling someone who is suffering deeply that God loves them greatly, without depth, without something to hold it up, sounds like hollow comfort. It sounds like the kind of thing people say when they don't know what to say, but feel they must say something. Saint Teresa of Jesus does not do that. She refuses to settle for vague reassurance. She goes deeper. And what she finds when she goes deeper is not an abstract theological explanation. It is a concrete distinction. A distinction that completely changes the way a suffering soul can look at its own pain. The distinction between suffering that comes from outside and suffering that comes from within. Between the suffering the soul endures because the world beats against it, and the suffering the soul endures because something within it is being moved, worked upon, and transformed by a force that is not its own. The suffering that comes from outside is the kind we all recognize: illness, loss, injustice, broken love. These are real sufferings. They hurt with an intensity no one should minimize, and Saint Teresa of Jesus never minimized them because she knew every single one. But there is another kind of suffering, a suffering with no visible cause, or one whose cause is visible, and yet whose intensity cannot be accounted for by that cause alone. A suffering that persists when everything on the outside should be fine. A suffering that brings with it a restlessness of the soul that cannot name itself, yet is absolutely real. A suffering that sometimes presents itself as a thirst, as a deep dissatisfaction with everything that once gave satisfaction, as the sense that something which once felt like enough no longer is, and you cannot say what is missing, but you know with certainty that something is. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that suffering from the inside, and what she discovered about it, what the Church later confirmed when her writings were examined, touches on a very specific spiritual reason, a reason that is not punishment, not abandonment, not a sign that you are doing something wrong. It is a sign that something is beginning. But before I tell you what is beginning, you need to understand why that particular suffering feels so different from all the rest. Why ordinary remedies leave it untouched. Why distraction doesn't dissolve it. Why rest doesn't erase it. Why even genuine moments of joy cannot fully extinguish it. There is a reason for that. And Saint Teresa of Jesus set it down in writing with a clarity that astonished even her own confessors. Men who read her words and didn't know what to do with them for years, until the Church recognized her writings as among the most lucid accounts of the interior life ever produced. That reason has to do with what happens in the soul when God decides the time has come to call it deeper within. And the first sign of that call is not peace. It is not consolation. It is not the feeling that everything is going well. The first sign is precisely the opposite. Saint Teresa of Jesus had a way of speaking about the soul that resembles no one else's. She did not speak of it as something abstract, a theological reality to be studied in books and debated in lecture halls. She spoke of the soul as a place, an interior space with temperature, with light, with depth. Something that can be explored, known, and inhabited in very different ways, depending on how far one has traveled toward God. And when Teresa spoke of interior suffering, the suffering of the soul that seeks God and cannot find Him in the way it expected, she used an image that was not metaphorical but experiential. She spoke of dryness, she also spoke of pain. And she drew between them a distinction that most suffering people have never heard, yet which changes everything once it is understood. Dryness is the suffering of the soul that tries to pray and feels nothing, that approaches God with genuine goodwill, that fulfills its spiritual duties, that does what it knows must be done, but receives no sensible response, no emotion, no consolation, only silence. Dryness is a real suffering, one that Saint Teresa of Jesus describes with great compassion in The Way of Perfection, because she understood what it costs a soul that loves God to not feel Him near. But dryness, on its own, is not necessarily a sign that something extraordinary is happening. It can be a sign of lukewarmness, of distraction, of too much noise in the outer life to leave space for the soul to listen. The deeper interior pain that Saint Teresa of Jesus describes is something else entirely. It is qualitatively different. And the difference does not lie in its intensity, though it is often more intense than dryness. The difference lies in what accompanies it. Dryness leaves the soul in a kind of indifference, a spiritual flatness that can, over time, become almost comfortable if the soul stops fighting against it. The pain Teresa describes at this deeper level does not leave the soul indifferent. It leaves the soul restless, dissatisfied with everything that once brought satisfaction, gripped by a thirst that nothing the world offers can quench, and that the soul cannot seem to quench through ordinary spiritual means either. That thirst is the key. Saint Teresa of Jesus returns to it again and again throughout her writings, because she knows it is the hallmark of something that is not sickness of the soul, but growth of the soul. A growth that hurts because all genuine growth hurts. A growth that disorients because it carries the soul into territory it has not yet mapped, where it does not yet have the instruments to move with ease. In The Way of Perfection, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes the moment when a soul that has lived in an honest spiritual routine begins to sense that the routine is no longer enough. Not because the routine was wrong, not because anything has gone wrong, but because something within the soul has grown beyond what the routine can hold. Something in its interior has developed a capacity for love and for seeking that the old containers can no longer contain. And that mismatch, the old containers straining against what the soul has become, produces a specific pain, the pain of something seeking form and not yet finding it. It is exactly the pain a child feels when growing, when bones are stretching faster than the body can keep up with. That pain does not mean the child is ill. It means the child is growing. It means the body is doing precisely what it ought to do, and that the pain is the inevitable cost of the process. To take that pain away from the child would not help the child. It would stop the growth. Saint Teresa of Jesus applies the same logic to the soul. The deep spiritual pain, the persistent kind, the kind that resists ordinary remedies, the kind that accompanies a soul that is genuinely seeking God and genuinely trying to live well, is not a sign that the soul is sick. It is a sign that the soul is growing beyond the limits it previously had. And that growth, Teresa says, does not come from the soul's own initiative. The soul does not grow itself. The soul is grown. There is someone growing it from within, and that someone has his own timing and his own methods, which do not always match what the soul would have chosen for itself if it had been consulted. This is where Saint Teresa of Jesus plants the central question of her teaching on suffering, a question that still has no easy answer today. If it is God who is at work in the soul, if the pain is a sign of His presence and not His absence, then why does He not say so? Why does He not tell the soul what He is doing so that the soul might cooperate peacefully rather than resist in fear? Why must the process be dark? Saint Teresa of Jesus gives an answer to that question, an answer that is not easy to hear, but which, when truly heard, produces exactly the opposite of what one might expect. Not resignation, something closer to relief? The answer, Saint Teresa of Jesus gives to that question, does not come wrapped in easy comfort. It comes wrapped in truth. And the truth she offers is this: the process must be dark, because if the soul knew in advance what it was about to let go of, it would not let go. And what it is about to let go of is precisely what is preventing it from reaching where God wants to take it. To understand this, you must first understand how attachment works in the soul. Not attachment to obvious sin, the kind we all recognize and try to move away from in confession. There is another kind of attachment, far more subtle and far harder to identify, because it does not look like attachment. It looks like devotion, like spiritual habit, like part of the identity the soul has built around its faith. These are attachments to a certain way of praying, to a certain image of oneself as a believing person, to a certain spiritual consolation the soul has learned to expect and to need. Attachments to concrete spiritual results, to feeling something at Mass, to receiving consolation when one prays, to having clarity when seeking God, to spiritual things working in a particular way that the soul already knows and within which it feels safe. Saint Teresa of Jesus was remarkably candid about these attachments because she recognized them in herself. And what she discovered is that when God wants to bring the soul to a deeper intimacy, He must first dismantle the structure of those attachments, not because they are wicked, but because they are no longer adequate for what is coming. They are like the scaffolding that is absolutely necessary while a building is being constructed, but which must be removed once the building stands on its own. The scaffolding is not the enemy of the building, but if it is never taken down, it obscures the building and ends up being confused with it. The dismantling of those attachments is what produces the deep spiritual pain we have been describing. When the soul loses the sensible consolation it counted on in prayer, there is pain. When the soul loses the clarity it once had about its own spiritual path, there is a disorientation that hurts. When the soul loses the image of itself as someone progressing visibly and measurably in the spiritual life, there is real suffering, because that image gave the soul a security it no longer has, and the soul naturally interprets that loss as a setback, as a failure, as evidence that something has gone wrong. Saint Teresa of Jesus says that in most cases, in the soul that is genuinely seeking God and genuinely trying to live in His love, that interpretation is mistaken. The soul has not gone backward. It has advanced so far that the instruments it previously used to measure its progress are no longer precise enough to capture it. The thermometer is not broken. It is simply that the warmth now present in the soul is of a kind that thermometer was never designed to measure. But here is the part that proves most difficult to accept. The dismantling is not comfortable. It was not comfortable for Teresa, and it is not comfortable for anyone. Because what is being dismantled is not some external thing easily identified and set aside. What is being dismantled is the interior architecture the soul built patiently over years as its way of relating to God. And losing that architecture, even to gain something incomparably better, feels at first like losing God entirely, like standing on nothing, like being suspended in mid-air with no sense of where you will land. Saint Teresa of Jesus describes that moment with an image she herself lived through and recorded in the book of her life. She describes the soul as someone who has spent many years learning to walk in a particular way and who suddenly finds that her legs no longer respond as they once did. Not because they are damaged, but because they are being reconfigured for a different kind of road, a road that requires an entirely different way of moving. During the reconfiguration, the soul cannot walk well in either the old way or the new one. It cannot walk as before because something has already shifted, and it cannot yet walk in the new way because it doesn't know it yet. That in-between period, when nothing works as expected, is what the soul experiences as the most baffling suffering of all. It is baffling because it has no clear external cause. It is baffling because ordinary remedies leave it untouched. It is baffling because it happens precisely in the soul that is most earnestly trying to do everything right. And that combination, inexplicable suffering in the soul that is making the greatest effort to love God, is what leads to the fundamental error we mentioned at the beginning. The error of believing that the suffering is punishment. The error of believing that if one were doing better, one would suffer less. Saint Teresa of Jesus turns this completely on its head. And she says something that is difficult to believe the first time one hears it, yet which resonates with a truth the soul recognizes from within when it is heard in the right way. She says that this specific suffering, this baffling, inexplicable suffering in the soul that is seeking God, is not a sign that God is far away. It is a sign that God is closer than He has ever been. So close that His very nearness is undoing something in the soul that had to be undone in order for the encounter to become real. And the soul doesn't yet know what follows that undoing. That is what makes the suffering so dark. But Saint Teresa of Jesus did know, because she reached the other side. And what she found there is what none of her sisters, none of her confessors, none of the theologians who examined her expected a woman of the 16th century to set down in writing with such precision and such peace. In the book of her life, Saint Teresa of Jesus writes a sentence that her confessors underlined and pressed her to explain for years. It surfaces in the middle of her account of the darkest periods of her interior life, those years when suffering was constant and consolation nowhere to be found. And the sentence, read without context, sounds almost scandalous. But read from the inside, from the place where she wrote it, it is one of the most luminous truths ever committed to paper about the relationship between the soul and God. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote that when the Lord wishes to enrich a soul, He first makes it poor. That before giving the soul something it could not have received in the state it was in, God empties it. And that this emptying feels exactly like loss, because it is loss. But it is the loss of what was too small for what is coming, not the loss of what the soul truly needs. Pause for a moment with that image. Think about what it means to be emptied. Not in the abstract sense, in the concrete sense Teresa is describing. Imagine you have carried for years a vessel you thought of as your own. A vessel you know well, one that fits your hand, that you know how to hold, that you have learned to carry with you everywhere. And that vessel has held good things: faith, devotion, certainty, spiritual consolation, real things, not imaginary or superficial things. The vessel has been yours for years and has served its purpose. And then one day, the vessel begins to empty, without your having tilted it. The faith is still there, but something that accompanied it is gone. The devotion remains, but something that made it recognizable to you has disappeared. The certainty you once had about your spiritual path has grown hazy, and what you feel is that you are losing something you had, that it is being taken from you. And since the vessel is all you know, since the vessel is what you have identified with yourself for years, you feel as though you are losing yourself. That is exactly what Saint Teresa of Jesus describes, and what she also describes, with the same honesty she brings to the emptying, is what happens next, when the vessel is empty enough. When the soul has released, not always voluntarily, not always through a heroic conscious decision, but sometimes simply because it could no longer hold on to what it had been holding. When the soul has arrived at the bottom of that emptying, something occurs that could not have occurred while the vessel was full of what came before. God can place something new within it, not a little more of the same, not a larger quantity of what the soul already possessed. Something qualitatively different, something the soul could not have contained without the prior emptying, because what it had before occupied the space that the new thing requires. Saint Teresa of Jesus speaks of this in the book of her life with a gratitude that is palpable even across the centuries. a gratitude born from the fact of having arrived at the other side and being able to compare what she had before the emptying with what she received afterward. And the comparison, she says, leaves no room for doubt. What came after was incomparably more than what existed before. But here, right here, is the specific spiritual reason no one has ever explained to you. The emptying you are living through, if you recognize yourself in what we have been describing, is not random. It is not the result of an unfortunate accumulation of circumstances. It is not a sign that your faith is weak or that your spiritual life is in decline. It is the specific method God uses when He has decided that a soul is ready to receive something it cannot yet imagine, but which He can already see. Saint Teresa of Jesus uses the word calling, not in the narrow sense of a religious vocation, in a far broader sense, one that applies to any soul that loves God and lives in His grace. The deep spiritual suffering, the persistent kind, the disorienting kind, the kind that accompanies the emptying, is the form this calling takes to make itself audible. It is how God tells the soul that there is something more, that what it holds until now is good, is real, is valuable, but it is not the end of the road, that the road continues, that there is more within, and that He wants to bring it there. The calling hurts because the soul does not yet know where it is being led. The calling disorients because the soul cannot yet see the destination. But the calling also carries with it, in the midst of the pain, something Saint Teresa of Jesus describes as unmistakable to those who know how to recognize it. A very gentle interior certainty, almost imperceptible at first, that the suffering being endured is not in vain, that there is a direction to it even if unseen, that someone knows where all of this is going even if the soul does not yet know. That quiet certainty within the pain is God's fingerprint on the suffering. It is the signature that distinguishes the pain He inhabits from the pain that simply passes through and leaves nothing but a scar. And learning to recognize it is one of the most important gifts Saint Teresa of Jesus bequeathed to us in her writings. If what Saint Teresa of Jesus describes is real, if deep spiritual suffering can be a sign of calling rather than punishment, then a question naturally arises that the soul needs to answer in order to move from fear towards something more like peace. The question is concrete and necessary. How do I know whether what I am living belongs to the category Teresa describes, or whether it is simply ordinary suffering, the kind that needs to be relieved in the way any pain is relieved? Saint Teresa of Jesus does not leave that question unanswered. It would have been cruel to do so. And Teresa was not cruel. She was precise. She was honest. She was, above all else, a woman who knew what it meant to suffer without understanding why, and who therefore took the trouble to record, in as much detail as she could, the signs that allow a suffering soul to find its bearings within its own pain. The first sign is persistence without deterioration. The deep spiritual suffering Teresa describes does not destroy the faith of the soul that endures it. It hurts, it disorients, it exhausts, but it does not erase faith. The soul being worked upon by God from within may be in total darkness and yet continue praying, continue attending Mass, continue going to confession, not because it feels consolation in any of these things, but because something within it knows it cannot stop. That persistence in the practice of faith despite the absence of consolation, that fidelity sustained not by feeling, but by something deeper than feeling, is for Saint Teresa of Jesus one of the clearest signs that the suffering has a spiritual direction and is not simply desolation. The second sign is the thirst that does not relent. The soul that is being called deeper does not grow indifferent to God in the midst of its suffering. Quite the opposite. It grows hungrier for Him, even when it cannot find a way to satisfy that hunger. There is a paradox here that Saint Teresa of Jesus observed with great care. The soul suffers because it cannot find God in the way it once found Him. but it finds no relief in giving up the search. Every time it tries to distract itself, every time it tries to fill the emptiness with something other than God, the emptiness grows larger. That inability to find a substitute, that thirst oriented only toward God, even when God seems out of reach, is the second sign. The third sign is what Teresa calls clean pain. It is one of her own expressions, and it requires explanation because it is not immediately intuitive. Clean pain is suffering that does not come with resentment toward God. The soul may be in the most absolute darkness, may be enduring something it does not understand, may be exhausted and disoriented, but at the foundation of that suffering, there is no accusation against God. None of the kind of anger that says, "This isn't fair. God is failing me. I have done everything and look at what I have to show for it." There may be a legitimate complaint. Teresa herself complained to God on more than one occasion with a frankness that surprises. But beneath the complaint, there is a trust that is not broken. The soul suffers but does not stop trusting. And that trust in the midst of pain, that absence of fundamental resentment, is for Teresa the third sign that the suffering has a spiritual root rather than a purely psychological or circumstantial one. The fourth sign is the hardest to put into words, yet perhaps the most recognizable to those who are living it. Saint Teresa of Jesus describes it as the sense that the suffering is doing something, not as an elaborate conviction, not as a carefully constructed theological argument, but as a very subtle, almost pre-logical interior perception that what is being endured is not in vain, that something is moving within the soul even if it cannot be seen, neither what it is nor where it is going. It is the difference between suffering that feels like a wall and suffering that feels like a passageway. Both hurt, but the passageway has a quality the wall does not. The wall closes. The passageway, even in darkness, carries a sense of direction. Many people who come to Saint Teresa of Jesus for the first time are astonished to find that a 16th century mystic can describe something they are living in the 21st century with an accuracy no contemporary psychology book has managed to capture in quite the same way. That astonishment is entirely legitimate, and the reason it happens is that Teresa was not describing cultural phenomena or historical moments. She was describing the soul, and the soul, in its deepest interior, does not change from century to century. Circumstances change, language changes, but the movement God makes within the soul that loves Him and that He is calling, that does not change from the 16th century to the 21st. And that is why Teresa still speaks. That is why she still reaches us. The question the soul needs to ask now, the question that opens the door to what Teresa teaches next, is this: if you recognize in your suffering any of those signs, if you recognize that persistence without deterioration, that thirst which does not relent, that clean pain, that sense of something moving though you cannot see it, what do you do with that? What posture does the soul adopt toward a suffering it has begun to suspect may not be accidental? The posture Saint Teresa of Jesus recommends before suffering with a spiritual root is not the one most people would expect. It is not the posture of heroism, not the posture of the person who stands tall and declares she will endure everything without complaint, not the posture of someone who turns her pain into a banner of her own virtue. Teresa recognized that temptation clearly and named it as one of the most specific dangers facing the soul that has reached a certain depth of spiritual life: the danger of making one's own suffering a source of concealed pride, of suffering outwardly in a way that seeks, without admitting it, the recognition of others or even the recognition of God. The posture Teresa recommends is far simpler in appearance and far more demanding in practice. It is the posture of someone who simply allows herself to be carried, not with the resignation of someone who no longer has the strength to resist, with something qualitatively different, which in the way of perfection, Teresa calls surrender from within. a surrender that is not passivity, a surrender that requires an act of the will, an act that sometimes has to be renewed not once, but many times throughout the day, because the human will has a tendency to reclaim the control it has just released. The surrender from within that Teresa describes has 3 concrete movements, ones she herself practiced and taught to her sisters at the Carmel. The first is to stop looking for the cause. When the soul is in deep spiritual suffering, the natural reaction is the search for explanation. The soul examines itself for the sin that might be causing the pain. It reviews its behavior, its confessions, its relationships, its spiritual practice. It looks for the mistake it must be paying for. And Saint Teresa of Jesus says that this movement, when it becomes obsessive, when the soul cannot stop searching for the cause, like someone digging for a splinter she cannot find, actually prolongs the suffering rather than shortening it. Not because an examination of conscience is harmful, which it is not, but because there comes a point at which examination becomes rumination, and rumination does not open the soul toward God. It closes it in upon itself. The first movement of surrender is to say, at some point in the suffering, I don't know why, and to trust that God does. That not knowing, spoken from faith rather than despair, is one of the most profound acts of trust a soul can make, because trust that rests on understanding is not yet full trust. Full trust is the kind that holds even when understanding fails. The second movement is to stop racing ahead to the end. A soul in suffering has an understandable tendency to live in the future, to ask when this will be over, to look for signs that the end is near, to negotiate with God for a deadline. And Teresa says that this movement, though it springs from genuine pain, also prolongs the suffering, because it places the soul in a state of constant tension between the present it is enduring and the future it imagines, and that tension consumes energy the soul needs for the very process it is living through. Not rushing ahead to the end means learning to be present within the suffering, rather than perpetually projecting oneself forward to when it will stop. It does not mean the soul cannot ask God for mercy and relief. Teresa asked for that too. But asking is different from living installed in anxious waiting. The third movement is the most counterintuitive of the 3. Teresa describes it in the way of perfection, with a phrase her sisters still remembered decades after her death, because it had unsettled them the first time they heard it. She told them that in deep spiritual suffering, the soul should not try to escape from it, but to inhabit it, not to settle into it in some morbid way, not to cultivate the pain as though it were a good in itself, but equally, not to spend all available energy in fleeing from it, in distancing the soul from its own suffering so thoroughly that the suffering is prevented from doing what it needs to do. To inhabit the suffering means to be present within it, to not dissociate from what is being lived, to resist in very concrete terms the urge to fill every silence with noise so as not to have to hear what the silence contains, to resist filling every available moment with activity so as not to have to sit with what rest reveals, to resist speaking compulsively about the pain to everyone around you in an effort to dilute it into words before it can say what it needs to say. Teresa was not recommending the stoic silence of someone who suppresses. She was recommending the receptive silence of someone who listens. Because within deep spiritual suffering, there is something that wants to be heard. Something trying to communicate a truth to the soul that will transform it once received. And that communication requires the soul to be still enough to receive it. Noise, flight, compulsive distraction do not eliminate the message. They merely delay the moment when the soul can finally hear it. And while the message waits, the suffering waits too, because the suffering does not cease until its work is finished. There is something Saint Teresa of Jesus describes in her writings that almost no one who suffers has ever heard. Not because it is locked away in some forgotten archive, but because it requires having arrived at the other side to describe it with authority. Most of those who speak about suffering speak from within it, not from after it. Teresa speaks from after. And what she describes from that vantage point is what the suffering soul needs to hear. Not to be comforted with empty promises, but to be able to orient its present pain toward what is already waiting for it at the end of the process. Teresa describes the moment when deep spiritual suffering begins to lift. And the first thing she says about that moment is that it does not arrive as you would expect. Not with a dramatic revelation, not with a sudden wave of spiritual elation, not with the instantaneous disappearance of pain as though someone had flipped a switch. The moment when the suffering begins to lift comes, according to Teresa, almost imperceptibly at first, like a shift in the temperature of the air before spring arrives. You know something has changed before you can say exactly what. What changes first, she says, is not the suffering itself, but the soul's relationship to its own suffering. The pain may still be present, but something in the way the soul carries it has changed. There is a lightness that was not there before, not the lightness of someone who no longer suffers, the lightness of someone who is no longer entirely identified with her suffering. Something within the soul has begun to be larger than the pain it is carrying. And that difference in size, even if small at first, is the first sign that the process is nearing its close. The second thing Teresa describes about that moment is that the soul living it usually does not recognize it straight away. There is a period of distrust. A soul that has suffered for a long time learns to mistrust relief because it has experienced many times the passing consolation that feels real and then fades, returning the soul to where it was before. Teresa understood that distrust because she had lived it, and she says something important about it. She says that distrust in itself is not an obstacle to the process, provided it does not become an active denial of what is happening. That is to say, the soul can doubt that the relief is real and at the same time allow itself to receive it provisionally, without committing to a certainty it does not yet have. That cautious openness does not close grace off. It receives it with the measure of prudence the soul needs given its history. What comes after that first imperceptible change, what Teresa describes in greatest detail and with the most evident emotion in her writings, is what she calls the recognition. The moment when the soul understands, with a clarity it did not have before, what was happening throughout the entire time of suffering, not as an intellectual explanation received from outside, as an understanding that rises from within, as though the soul from the other side of the process could see the entire road it had traveled and recognize in it an architecture that was completely invisible during the journey. Teresa describes this recognition as one of the moments of greatest gratitude in her spiritual life. Not gratitude for the suffering itself, with some distorted attitude that treats pain as desirable in its own right, but gratitude for what the suffering produced, for the space it created, for the new capacity it left within the soul when it withdrew, for the depth that can only be gained through certain kinds of darkness, for the intimacy with God that would not have been possible without the prior process of emptying. There is an image Teresa uses in this context that is particularly powerful. She speaks of the caterpillar and the butterfly, not as a passing illustration, but in a way that is technically precise in terms of what she is describing. The caterpillar does not know it will become a butterfly. When it enters the cocoon, it has no awareness of what awaits it on the other side. It only knows that something within is driving it to enclose itself, to darken, to become still in a way that from the outside looks like death. And if the caterpillar could think, if it could put into words what it feels inside the cocoon, it would probably describe it very much the way a soul describes deep spiritual suffering: darkness, stillness, the loss of what it was, total disorientation. But from the cocoon emerges something the caterpillar could not have imagined, something that is not an improved caterpillar, something qualitatively different, something capable of doing what the caterpillar could never do. And Saint Teresa of Jesus says that the soul that has passed through deep spiritual suffering and arrived at the other side experiences something analogous. It is not the same soul with a few problems solved. It is a soul that has developed capacities that did not exist before, a depth of love that was not possible before, an interior freedom from everything that previously agitated it, a freedom it could never have reached through its own efforts, no matter how hard it had tried. And all of that, says Teresa, was waiting at the end of the process from the very beginning. The suffering did not produce it. The suffering revealed it, made it possible. It was the necessary cocoon for what was already contained within the soul as a possibility not yet found its form. Everything Saint Teresa of Jesus taught about suffering converges on a single point, a point that is at once the simplest of all and the hardest for the soul to accept when it is in the midst of pain. A point that is not a theological conclusion, but a personal reality, one she lived first and described afterward, with the authority of someone speaking from experience rather than speculation. The point is this: deep spiritual suffering is not what happens to the soul God has forgotten. It is what happens to the soul God has chosen to lead further within. The spiritual reason no one had explained to you is not an abstract reason, not a theoretical compensation to be accepted simply because there is no other option. It is a reason with a name, with a direction, with a specific recipient, and that recipient is you. Saint Teresa of Jesus came to understand this, not in a sudden flash of illumination, but after years, after those 20 years of darkness we mentioned at the beginning. And when the understanding finally arrived in full force, the first thing she felt was not relief in the sense we normally expect when a pain ends. The first thing she felt was something for which she spent a long time searching for words, because ordinary language was not built to hold it. What she felt was the certainty of having been seen, of having been known in the deepest interior of her being by someone who also knew the darkness she had inhabited throughout that long stretch of time, and who had been there, inside that darkness, with her, without her being able to see him. That certainty of having been seen and accompanied in suffering without knowing it is the spiritual reason that transforms past pain without erasing it. The pain was real. The time it lasted was real. The darkness was real. None of that is undone. But the meaning changes entirely when the soul discovers that it was never alone for a single moment, that what it interpreted as God's absence was in reality God's presence operating in a way the soul was not yet capable of recognizing, that the silence it lived as abandonment was in reality a silence of work, the silence of someone doing something delicate, and knowing that if he stopped midway to offer explanations, the work could not be completed. Saint Teresa of Jesus compares this silence of God during suffering to the silence of a sculptor working stone. The sculptor does not explain to the stone what he is doing. He does not ask permission. He does not stop work periodically to console the stone for the blows it is receiving. He works in silence, with precision, knowing what he is removing and what he is leaving, and the stone, if it could feel, would probably experience the blows as pure senseless violence, as destruction without purpose, right up until the moment the sculpture was finished, right up until the moment when it could see from outside what the blows had produced. Teresa says that the soul in deep spiritual suffering is the stone, and that God is the sculptor, and that the blows, though they land like blows, are producing something the soul cannot see from within the process, something that can only be seen from afterward. And when it is seen from afterward, when the soul can contemplate what the suffering produced in it, the reaction Teresa describes is not the resignation of someone who accepts that the end justified the means. It is the astonishment of someone who discovers she was loved with an intensity and a precision that exceeded everything she could have imagined. This is what Saint Teresa of Jesus confirms about profound suffering, that if you search honestly within yours for the signs she described, if you find that persistence without deterioration, that thirst which does not relent, that clean pain, that sense of something moving though you cannot see it, then what you are living is not an accident. It is not a punishment. It is not a sign that God looks upon you with less love than He shows those who appear to suffer less. It is a sign that He has chosen you for something greater than you can yet see. It is a sign that the sculptor is already at work, that the blows have a direction, even if you cannot feel it yet, that on the other side of this process, there is something that none of the words spoken here today can fully anticipate, because it is in the very nature of what God is doing in you that it only reveals itself completely when it is finished. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not promise that the suffering would be brief. She did not promise it would be easy to understand. She promised something truer and more solid than either of those things. She promised that it was not in vain, that it had a reason, that that reason had a name the soul would come to know, and that when it knew it, everything else would fall into place in a way it cannot yet imagine, but which is already waiting for it. You have come this far, not by coincidence, not simply because you had some time to spare this evening, but because something in you needed to hear exactly this, because there is a suffering you have been carrying for some time now, and no one had known how to name it in a way that reached the place where it truly hurts. And what Saint Teresa of Jesus has given you today is not the kind of comfort that evaporates the moment you close your eyes. It is a truth with roots, a truth that can hold you in the darkness because it comes from someone who knew that darkness from within and who reached the other side and reached back a hand toward you. What you received today is this, that the suffering which will not relent, the persistent kind, the kind with no clear visible cause, the kind that disorients precisely the soul most earnestly trying to love God, is not a sign of abandonment. It is a sign of calling. That the emptying you feel is not final loss, but preparation for something the previous state could never have held. That the darkness in which you sometimes cannot see your own hands is not the darkness of God's forgetfulness, but the darkness of the sculptor who works in silence because he knows what he is doing, and because stopping to explain midway would interrupt what is not yet finished. That the thirst you carry, the thirst no worldly thing can satisfy, is not a sickness of the soul, but its clearest sign of life, because only the living soul thirsts. Only the soul that still seeks is the soul that still grows. And you received something more. You received the signs. Persistence without deterioration. The thirst that does not relent. Clean pain without resentment at the core. The sense that something is moving even when you cannot see it. These signs are not absolute guarantees, because the spiritual life does not work in mathematical certainties. They are orientations. They are the kind of light Saint Teresa of Jesus lit in her writings so that the souls who came after her, souls who did not have the gift of knowing her in person or of sitting at her feet in the Carmel, might have at least something to hold on to in the dark. And you have that now. Keep it. Not as a formula to be applied mechanically, as a truth to be inhabited, as something you return to when the weight becomes too heavy again, and you need someone to remind you that the weight is not permanent, that it has a direction, that there is something at the end of this process that justifies the process. Not because the suffering was something to be desired, but because what it produces in the soul that walks through it in faith is incomparably more real and more lasting than what could have been produced without it. Now, I want to speak to you about something, not about the suffering we have already named, about something that comes after. Because what Saint Teresa of Jesus taught does not end at the threshold we have crossed today. It ends much further within. And there is a reality of the spiritual life directly connected to everything you have heard this evening. A reality that the soul, beginning to understand its own suffering, needs to know about, lest it stop halfway along the road, lest it hold the key in its hand without knowing there is a door to open. Saint Teresa of Jesus dedicated years of her life to writing about what happens when the soul crosses that threshold. When the emptying has done its work, when the sculptor has finished one stage and begun the next, when what was darkness begins to take on a different texture. She did not describe it with the language of a manual or the cold detachment of someone cataloging experiences from the outside. She described it from within, from the astonishment of someone who found herself in territory without prior maps and who had to learn to move through it with the only instruments she had, her intelligence, her honesty, and her love of God. What she wrote about that territory of the soul, about what awaits on the other side of the suffering we have described today, is something very few people have ever had the privilege of hearing, explained with the clarity it deserves. Not because it is inaccessible, but because it requires having first understood what you understood today in order to land in the right place. It requires having grasped the purpose of the emptying in order to receive what follows the emptying. It requires having recognized the pain as a threshold in order to cross the threshold with open eyes. And that is exactly what you now have. What you heard today was the preparation. What lies ahead of today is the rest of the road. And Saint Teresa of Jesus did not leave you halfway along it. She left it written all the way to the end. There is something waiting for you, something Teresa saw and described in words that still cause those who read them to stop and read them again, unable to quite believe they are real. Something about what happens to the soul when God completes what He began in it through suffering. Something that changes not only how the soul sees its past pain, but how it sees everything else, its life, its faith, the people around it, the time that remains, and what comes after time. That is what follows, and it will be here when you are ready to receive it. Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote, at the end of one of her darkest periods, a sentence her sisters found on a folded piece of paper tucked beside her breviary. A sentence with no context, no explanation, no visible recipient. It seemed written for no one, which is why it was written for everyone. It said that those who truly love do not know how to go slowly. That love, when it is real, is in a hurry. Not the hurry of someone running away, the hurry of someone who has already seen where she is going and cannot stop walking. You already know where you are going. Walk. God is with you at every step, especially the ones that hurt most. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, from where she stands now, is still reaching out her hand